The morning sun had just begun to warm the sleepy main street of Maplewood, a small American town where the tallest buildings were the old clock tower and the red brick bank on the corner. The air still smelled faintly of dew and cut hay drifting in from the surrounding fields. From the far end of the street, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s walked at a steady pace toward the bank. His skin was a rich, weathered brown, lined by decades of summer heat and winter wind. His hands, calloused, strong, looked as though they still carried the feel of a plow handle. James Carter, a lifelong farmer, dressed in worn denim overalls over a faded plaid shirt, his boots leaving faint traces of dry soil on the sidewalk with every step. In one hand, he carried a battered leather wallet, the kind that had been softened by years of use. Inside, tucked carefully between old receipts and a photograph of his late wife, was a single crisp check. The paper was new, but the weight of what it represented had been building for years. James paused in front of the bank's tall glass doors. Through them, he could see the cool, polished interior, the marble floor gleaming under the soft glow of hanging brass lamps, the quiet hum of a printer, the faint tap of computer keys. Customers in pressed suits and clean dresses stood in short lines, waiting for their turn. He reached for the handle, holding the door open for a woman in a business skirt who was hurrying out with a paper coffee cup. She smiled politely, but her eyes slid away before meeting his for more than a second. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper, ink, and the lemon-scented polish used on the wood counters. The quiet murmur of conversation and the occasional metallic clink of coins echoed softly. James stepped to the end of the shortest line, ignoring the curious glance from a man in a crisp blue shirt ahead of him. As he waited, he glanced up at the framed photographs lining the wall, smiling portraits of the bank's board of directors, all taken in front of the same American flag backdrop. James recognized a few of the faces. Maplewood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, at least by sight. But today, he wasn't here to make small talk or swap weather predictions. He was here for a purpose, one he'd been planning for over 2 decades. The check in his wallet wasn't a payment for seed or feed. It wasn't a loan. It was a sum large enough to turn heads, a sum that had come from years of early mornings, long days in the fields, and careful saving. And in a matter of minutes, he'd handed over the counter. James took a slow, steady breath, his gaze drifting to the teller stations at the front. Most of the employees were young, moving quickly between customers with practiced smiles. At the far left station stood a young woman with bright blonde hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, her movements brisk, her smile just slightly too tight to feel warm. She glanced at him briefly when his turn came, and James thought he saw the faintest narrowing of her eyes. He stepped forward anyway, ready to finish what he came here to do. James stepped up to the counter, the leather of his wallet creaking softly as he opened it. The teller, whose nameplate read Claire Whitman, didn't offer the easy smile she had just given to the businessman ahead of him. Her gaze flicked over his worn boots, his denim overalls, and the faded flannel shirt that hung loosely on his frame. When her eyes finally reached his face, they lingered for only a moment before sliding back down to the counter, as if she had already made up her mind about him. "Yes?" she said in a clipped tone, the word more like a transaction than a greeting. James, unfazed, returned her cool tone with the calm steadiness of a man who'd weathered bigger storms. "Morning. I'd like to cash this check." He slid it across the counter, the pale rectangle of paper standing out against the dark, polished wood. Claire picked it up with the tips of her fingers, as though wary of smudging it, and her eyebrows inched upward as she read the amount. It was a figure that could buy a house outright, or several acres of farmland, a figure so large it looked almost out of place in a small-town bank. Her voice dropped slightly, but the edge remained. "This is a very large amount." "Yes, ma'am," James said simply, his hands resting lightly on the counter. She set the check down, her fingers lingering on it. "And do you have an account with us?" "I do." He slid his worn driver's license forward. "Been banking here for years." Claire glanced at the license, then back at him, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Still, this will require verification. We don't just cash checks like this without knowing exactly where they came from." James's expression didn't change. "It's from the sale of my land out west. The funds have cleared. Shouldn't be a problem." Claire gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, as if she knew better. I'll still need to run this through our fraud prevention system. Her voice carried just enough volume for the older man in the next line over to look up from his phone. A faint murmur spread among a few customers in earshot. James could feel the subtle shift in the room, the way eyes lingered a little longer, the way whispers slowed just enough to be about him. I understand you have policies, James said evenly, his voice quiet but steady. I'm happy to wait if you need to check it. But there's nothing wrong with the check. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. We'll see, she said, already rising from her stool, with the check in hand. She didn't meet his eyes again, walking briskly toward the back offices. James stayed where he was, calm but heavy-hearted, his fingertips tapping softly against the wood. He had come here expecting a simple transaction. Instead, he felt the weight of every unspoken judgment in the room pressing down on him. James remained at the counter, standing tall but still, his hat in one hand and his wallet in the other. The marble floor beneath his boots gleamed under the soft light, but he could feel the coldness creeping up from it, as though the building itself disapproved of him. Claire disappeared into a small glass-walled office at the back of the bank. Through the transparent pane, James could see her speaking to another employee, a man in a dark suit with a receding hairline. They both glanced in his direction more than once, their mouths moving in muted conversation. From his position, James could feel the shift in the room. Two women in tailored blazers, standing near the next counter over, had stopped talking about their weekend plans and were now stealing glances at him over the tops of their phones. An older gentleman with a cane in line behind James leaned toward the person next to him and muttered something, prompting a faint shake of the head. It wasn't loud, not exactly, but it was enough. Enough to feel the quiet judgment thickening the air. Claire returned a few minutes later, check still in hand, her face carrying the brittle composure of someone about to make a scene they felt justified in making. She didn't lower her voice. Mr. Carter, she began, her tone sharper than before. We can't simply cash a check of this size without significant verification. We'll have to hold it for several business days while our security department investigates. James nodded once. I understand the need for care, but the funds have cleared. This is from a reputable bank, and I have identification. She tilted her head slightly, her voice pitched just enough to carry across the room. Identification isn't enough when the source of funds is unclear. A faint ripple passed through the customers behind him. James heard a muffled chuckle somewhere to his left. The words hung in the air, deliberate and heavy. I'm telling you exactly where it came from, James replied, still calm, but his voice firm. It's the proceeds from land I sold. I've worked that land for more than 30 years. Claire didn't flinch. Be that as it may, our policies... The man with the cane coughed pointedly, leaning on the counter beside James. If that's policy, I hope you treat everyone like this, he said dryly. Claire's eyes flickered, but she didn't respond to him. Instead, she set the check down on the counter, keeping one hand over it as though guarding it. You're welcome to wait while we run further checks, Mr. Carter, but I can't promise we'll have an answer today. The way she said it made it sound less like an inconvenience and more like a warning. James inhaled slowly, letting the breath out through his nose. He'd been through worse, but there was something different about this moment. It wasn't just the delay. It was the way the delay had been made into a performance, a display in front of strangers, as though he had to be proven worthy of his own money. The marble clock above the tellers ticked on, loud in the quiet. James kept his gaze steady, refusing to let the room see him flinch. The muted hum of the bank was broken by the sharp click of polished shoes on marble. From the far end of the counter, a man in a dark gray suit strode forward with a measured pace, his expression tight, his eyes fixed on James. Richard Hansen, branch manager for nearly 2 decades, carried himself like a man used to authority, the kind whose decisions weren't questioned often. He stopped beside Claire's station, resting one hand on the counter, as if to claim the space. Mr. Carter, he began, his voice smooth but laced with condescension, I understand there's an issue with a check you're trying to cash. No issue, James replied evenly. Just a large amount. I told her where it came from and the funds are good. Hansen picked up the check, holding it between his thumb and forefinger, as though evaluating more than just numbers on the page. He glanced at James's license, then back to his face, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. "This is a significant sum," Hansen said, enunciating each word. "It's not every day we see a transaction of this size, from someone outside our regular high-value clientele." The phrase hung in the air. A couple of customers behind James exchanged glances. James's voice stayed calm. "I've been a customer here for years. My deposits might not have been flashy, but they've been steady. This money is the result of a lifetime of work." Hansen gave a polite, almost dismissive smile. "I'm sure it is. However, our security protocols require us to take extra precautions. We can't just hand over this amount without substantial verification." "And how long will that take?" James asked, his tone still measured. Hansen clasped his hands together. "It could be several days, possibly a week. I'd recommend you return later, once we've confirmed everything through our channels." James studied the manager for a moment. The man's crisp tie, his manicured nails, the faint scent of expensive cologne. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," Hansen said, lowering his voice only slightly, "we'll hold the check in a secure location until we're satisfied it's legitimate." The way he said legitimate carried a weight that was impossible to miss. From the corner of the room, a middle-aged man waiting for a loan appointment shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tension was palpable now, the kind that made conversations stall and glances dart away. James straightened his shoulders. "You have my ID. You have my account history. If you want to run your checks, fine. But I'm not here to be treated like a suspect for handling my own money." For a flicker of a second, something in Hansen's face tightened. But just as quickly, the professional mask returned. "We'll let you know when we're ready to proceed, Mr. Carter." Claire's eyes were on Hansen now, not James, but her lips were pressed into a small line of satisfaction. James remained standing at the counter for a long beat, his gaze unwavering, before he stepped back. He wasn't leaving yet, but he could feel that this was about to turn into something much bigger than a simple transaction. The tension in the bank was so thick you could hear every little sound: the hum of the printer, the faint shuffle of paper, the muted ticking of the wall clock above the tellers. James stood near the counter, arms folded loosely, waiting without fidgeting, a statue of patience in a room that was silently judging him. Then, the front doors burst open with a rush of warm, late-morning air. A man in a dark navy suit and a bright gold tie hurried inside, his polished shoes clicking rapidly on the marble floor. He was young, maybe early 30s, with neatly cropped hair and an expression that was a mix of urgency and relief. "There you are," the man called, his voice carrying across the quiet lobby. "Mr. Carter, I've been looking all over for you." Heads turned. Even Hansen, still standing near Claire's station, straightened slightly. The man approached James quickly, extending a hand. "I'm David Ross, assistant to Mayor Harper. Sir, everyone's waiting for you at City Hall. We're already behind schedule for the ceremony." A murmur went through the room. "Ceremony? City Hall?" James's calm gaze met David's. "I just stopped by to cash the check first," he said evenly, "so the donation can be processed right after." "Donation?" Claire's voice cracked just slightly. David turned toward her, clearly confused by her expression. "Yes, the donation. The mayor and the entire school board are waiting to honor Mr. Carter for his generosity. He's giving $3 million to the Maplewood Education Foundation. It's the largest private gift in the district's history." The words landed like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved. Hansen's jaw seemed to stiffen involuntarily. Claire's eyes darted from the check still on the counter to James's face, her posture suddenly unsure. The customers who had been quietly watching now openly stared, some of them exchanging embarrassed glances. David continued, clearly unaware of the silent drama that had unfolded before he arrived. "We've got the press set up, the school choir ready to perform. It's a big deal, sir. The kids even made thank you banners." James gave a small nod. "I'll be along shortly. Just need to finish here." Now all eyes were on Hansen and Claire. The check, that very check they had just questioned so publicly, sat in plain sight. The amount printed on it suddenly had a context that none of them had imagined. A faint color crept up Claire's neck. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. David glanced between them, the confusion finally dawning into realization. Wait, is there a problem here? James didn't answer. He simply looked at Hanson, waiting to see if the manager would find his words. The silence in the bank stretched on, taut and almost unbearable. The kind of silence where even the air feels charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Every pair of eyes in the lobby was fixed on the three people at the center. James Carter, standing tall and unshaken. Richard Hanson, the branch manager whose professional mask was starting to crack. And Claire Whitman, the teller whose cheeks had flushed a deep pink. Richard cleared his throat, the sound echoing more loudly than he probably intended. Mr. Carter. His voice was softer now, almost hesitant. It seems there's been a misunderstanding. James raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Claire shifted her weight from one foot to the other, fingers fidgeting with the edge of the counter. Gone was the crisp confidence from earlier. In its place was the visible discomfort of someone realizing the full weight of their mistake. David Ross, the mayor's assistant, looked between them, still holding his leather folder against his side. Misunderstanding, he repeated, incredulous. This man is about to change the lives of hundreds of kids in Maplewood. I hope you're not making him jump through hoops just to cash his own check. Several customers murmured in agreement. One older woman in the back, who had been pretending to read a deposit slip, shook her head and whispered something sharp to her husband. Richard straightened his tie. Of course not. We just follow certain procedures when dealing with large transactions. His voice faltered slightly. But obviously in Mr. Carter's case. In my case? James's voice was calm, but the steel in it was undeniable. You mean in the case where you didn't think someone who looks like me could have earned this money honestly? The words landed like a blow. Claire's eyes dropped instantly to the floor. Richard's mouth opened as if to speak, but no excuse came out. From the corner of the room, a man in work boots, clearly fresh from a construction site, let out a quiet, "That's right," under his breath. David stepped in, his voice cutting through the tension. Mr. Carter, the mayor would be honored to have you arrive with him personally. We've got the press waiting. Let's get you to City Hall. I'll have someone from our office handle the check processing so there's no further delay. His eyes flicked sharply toward Richard as he said the last word. Richard gave a quick, jerky nod, suddenly eager to show compliance. Yes, of course. We'll expedite everything immediately. Claire, take care of it at once. Claire swallowed hard and took the check back in trembling hands, her earlier superiority now replaced by an almost timid efficiency. Yes, sir. As she began typing into her computer, the bank's lobby remained unnervingly quiet. Not because people weren't talking, but because everyone was listening. Listening to the clack of her keyboard, the shuffle of the check being endorsed, the hum of the printer spitting out confirmation slips. For the first time since he'd walked in, James allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Not one of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction, because the truth had a way of cutting through even the thickest clouds of prejudice. Claire slid the processed check back across the counter, her hands careful, her eyes not quite meeting James's. Alongside it was a neat printed receipt, proof that the funds were now available in his account. There you go, Mr. Carter, she said quietly, her voice stripped of its earlier edge. Everything is all set. James took the check and the receipt, folding them neatly into his wallet. Thank you, he replied evenly, not unkind, but without softening his tone. He didn't owe them comfort for their guilt. Richard Hanson stepped forward, his smile tight and his hand extended. Mr. Carter, I apologize for the inconvenience. James looked at the hand but didn't take it right away. You don't need to apologize for the inconvenience, he said, his deep voice steady, filling the space. You need to apologize for the assumption. A murmur ran through the customers. Richard's face colored slightly, but he gave a small nod. You're right, I'm sorry for my assumption. James finally shook his hand, but the gesture was brisk, almost businesslike. Then he turned to David Ross, who was watching with quiet approval. Let's go, James said. As they walked toward the glass doors, the atmosphere in the bank shifted. People who had looked at him earlier with suspicion or mild curiosity now looked with something closer to respect, and maybe a bit of shame. The man with the cane gave him a firm nod. The woman in the blazer, who had been pretending to check her phone, smiled faintly. Outside, the midday sun poured across the street, glinting off the polished hood of a waiting black town car. David opened the door for James, but before getting in, James paused and looked back at the bank. Through the glass, he could see Claire at her station, still watching him. He didn't smile, but he gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that said, "I saw what you did, and I hope you learned from it." David closed the car door behind him, and they pulled away towards City Hall. As they drove, James could already see the crowd gathering, school children holding bright hand-painted banners, the mayor standing on the steps, reporters adjusting their cameras. For James, the check he'd just deposited wasn't just money. It was 30 years of sweat, sacrifice, and steadfast belief in something better. And in a way, the lesson he'd left behind in that bank, about dignity, assumptions, and the danger of judging by appearances, was worth just as much as the donation itself.